Okay, so for this first video lecture for the Module 2 on interdisciplinarity of STS, we're going to talk about modernization. But before that, let's talk about the social and technical change theories, no, that basically leads to development of a certain society and the role of science and technology and social forces in making social and technical change happen in a given society. So the first theorist is J.K. Galbraith, and J.K. Galbraith basically coined the term technodeterminism. And according to technodeterminism, a society's technology primarily determines the development of its social structure and cultural values. So according to Galbraith, the extent of technology and the way it permeates in our everyday lives basically direct how a society is changing in a given time. He argues that technological innovations are the primary motivators and drivers of cultural change. And we've seen this in, the recent decade, how a lot of our social interactions have changed and it became more online based, and how we see a lot of businesses changing the culture of the way they made transactions by getting into e-commerce. And of course, now more than ever, we see education sectors trying to keep up with technological advances, especially during this time of the pandemic, that we cannot have a physical classroom. Now, the extent to which technological innovations get to permeate within the culture and change it is also based on the law of the cultural diffusion of technology, which says that there are certain segments of the population who will be able to adapt and integrate technology into their lives based on a certain, psychological, behavioral, and social demographic characteristic. So basically, in a society, we have what we call early adapters. So sino yung early adapters? They are the people in a society who will most likely try a new technological innovation once it's available in a given society. So for example, these are the people who would, not think long before they buy a new iPhone or a new technological invention, because they believe that it's something that could potentially, improve their lives. And then we also have what we call the late adapters. So the late adapters naman usually would take a little bit of time before they try out a new technology once it enters a society. So these are the people who would watch out first, how do the early adapters think about the technology, and that's the time we're going to integrate it into our system. And then, of course, we also have what we call the laggards. The laggards are those who will resist new technology. So this would be usually the older segment of the population who are very resistant and skeptical to new technology. And if they could go around that using new technology, they would. No? And of course, a very small part of the society are what we call innovators. So they're the ones who introduce the new technology. So relatively, societies are could be imagined this way, no? That the population is broken down to innovators, early adapters, late adapters, and laggards. And of course, if there are more early adapters than laggards in a population, it's easier for technology to diffuse into the culture and therefore also cause some sort of cultural change. The time between a technology is introduced in a given society and the extent to which society adapts to it, like for example, ICT technologies and the time wherein ICT technologies are introduced in the Philippines, and the extent to which institutions would integrate it into their everyday transactions, the time between that is your cultural gap. Now, if the cultural gap is too long than, necessary, then it's called a cultural lag. Now, there are many factors that influence certain cultural lags. Ang una is cultural values. So there are certain societies who are very traditional in nature. There are more late adapters and laggards compared to early adapters, and therefore those in positions who will be able to influence policies to be able to include this new technology into everyday life, into the norms, into the laws, into the policies, wouldn't be so incentivized to put them into those into those policies. So may cultural lag, and at the same time, of course, we also consider the basic technological requirements of the new technology. Like for example, there are so many apps and so many gadgets that are being produced in developed countries, but it's so hard to imagine putting them here in the Philippines, especially in the rural areas, because the basic technological requirements like good internet connections, good cell sites aren't in existence. So that also contributes to the cultural lag. And of course, we also consider that there is a generational gap in relation to adapting to new technologies. We would see, throughout histories, that those who are of an older generation in a given time would most likely be skeptical and resist against new technological innovations. The next theorist on theories on social and technical change is W. Rostow, and he offered a structuralist functionalist perspective on social and technical change, and he argues that society evolves like an organism that slowly adapts to its physical environment and organizes to achieve balance and harmony. So basically, societies and cultures are understood as creatures that will change based on the physical environment that it is surrounded with. And like for example, in our current global society, we are plagued by changes of climate patterns, and this has caused us to introduce new technologies and ways of living that are more sustainable, and we had to do it because if we want to maintain and survive in this world, our societies have to adapt to these changes. W. Rostow further categorizes societies based on production and consumption, and the first categorization is pre-industrial society. So pre-industrial societies basically are characterized by limited production, means that there's not much technology found in these communities to be able to do mass production. So usually what are these type of communities? These are agricultural communities and indigenous communities that are probably hunter and gatherer and nomadic in nature. So their usual way of life is to be able to just focus on survival rather than creating a surplus of goods, which is different with our next type of society, which is industrial, which is characterized by mass production. So in these societies, we already have certain technologies that allow for the creation of surplus of goods, and therefore the focus of the people here is not just biological survival anymore, because we have enough for everyone. All you have to do is have certain economic productivity so that you'll be able to access these resources that are already available because of the mass production, and currently the Philippines, majority of the Philippines, especially its urban centers, are in an industrial society state. And finally, for the more developed countries, they are now in a post-industrial phase wherein aside from mass production, they also have mass consumption. They still have production, but they are already veering away from that because in a globalized society, they could get their produces from other countries or other societies that are industrial and pre-industrial. So their course of action now in the way of life is more on consumption based. So example of these countries are European countries, United States, and other developed countries. And then of course we remember Karl Marx. He also theorized about social change, and according to Karl Marx, it could be described as historical materialism. And basically, it argues that society is a dynamic system that is prone to conflict, contradiction, because of the ongoing clash between the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie and the working class and the proletariat, because of course we know the story of how capitalism is prone to abuse. Capitalist class who owns the means of production will go out of their way in order to bleed the working class dry with low profits, bad working conditions, to be able to maximize gains and maximize profits. And eventually, the working class will be sick and fed up of this this kind of arrangement, and they will rise up against the capitalist class, and therefore suggest a new way of distributing the goods in society. So, there. So, as I have explained, the modes of production influence the evolution of societies, especially when we enter the capitalist era. The ruling class hold the force of production to maintain the status quo, and of course, this produces abuse and alienation among the working class. And now, presently, when we imagine this capitalist class, they are now the technocrats, the class who owns and controls the technology and dominate the means of production. Because one of the more important materials that we have now in this day and age is information. So those who hold digital technologies, like for example, sila Mark Zuckerberg, Apple, Google, they are considered technocrats because they control a lot of the raw materials, the data that basically informs how the world works at the moment. So now that we learn how communities and societies change, let's talk about modernization. So modernization is a gradual, evolutionary, unidirectional process of social change wherein a society moves from a primitive to an advanced state. This movement is considered good since it connotes progress, humanity, and civilization and efficiency. Now, what are the different characteristics of modernization? First, it's phased. So it comes in phases. So if you remember in the theories that we have had earlier, so we have it comes from a pre-industrial phase to an industrial phase to a post-industrial phase. Next is it homogenizes the culture. So it's a unification to a single identity, which is usually modern culture is almost the same. It's impersonal, it's bureaucratic, it's efficient, it's calculable, it's reflexive. So most urban centers all around the world has that common spirit or cultural identity. Next, we have westernization. So again, we homogenize into a common culture, and usually what is that common culture that we share in urban centers in modern societies? European and Western models. Next is it's irreversible. So it's unidirectional. There's no going back to the original state. You can only just move forward. There's no community that is now an industrial state that will come back to a pre-industrial state. Usually it's not. Because usually in order for you to come into an industrial state, you have to change the landscape. You have to build infrastructure. And of course, industrial societies like agricultural societies, they are dependent on the landscape. So if it had already been developed, mahirap na siyang ibalik into an agricultural or hunter-gatherer state. Kaya nga, di ba, we have to be very careful about deforestation and, turning lands into residential areas because there's no going back. You cannot reclaim agricultural lands once you've developed them. Next, it's progressive. So it goes from a backward state of living to a more advanced state of living. Of course, backward as a qualifier is very discriminatory against those who are not yet in an industrial phase. Next, it's lengthy. It takes a long period of time, slow process, there. So it took a lot of time before the European nations are now in the best, states of their lives right now. And in the Philippines as well, it took a lot of time from pre-industrial phase that we are now turning to become industrial in terms of our phase in the development process. Next, it's systematic. It follows a distinct standard pattern that is common to everyone because we have a common metric that is used all over the world, and it's transformative. It's overall. It's an encompassing change. It will permeate even the most minute experiences in life. Even from it can talk about how governments govern, that big, how churches run their religious services, how schools do their education, to more mundane, minute things like where do we get our resources, how do we cook our food, How do we greet each other? How do we talk each other? So, and you will be able to differentiate how in this very minor non-verbal cues you can say that this person comes from a modernized community and this one doesn't come from a modernized community. And it's immanent. The process daw is inevitable. Definitely, if you want to make it as a competitive society in this world, you have to develop, based on the current system that we have right now. And what are the characteristics of a quote-unquote non-modernized society? Because non-modernized sounds so discriminatory, so stigmatizing from an anthropological and a sociological standpoint, and I want to maintain that stance that it is stigmatizing. So we're just describing this based on the literature, no? So first, there's a low degree of specialization, meaning most of the people do the same thing, right? So if there's a hunter-gatherer societies, they hunt and they gather. Agricultural communities usually, the work of the people, majority of the people revolves around, agriculture. So there are harvesters, there are farmers, of course, and if, for example, a fisher folk community, most of the things that they do revolves around that. So there are those who make boats, those who sell fish, who catch fish, there are those who make the fishing nets. So there's low degree of specialization, unlike industrial societies wherein there's specialized people. Okay? And we'll discuss that later. There's high level of self-sufficiency. They are able to they are able to make their own survival related resources like food, without being dependent on outside communities. Their cultural norms are more traditional and less Western compared to industrial counterparts, and they have relatively low emphasis on money circulation in the market compared to industrialized counterparts. And they are still very much in tune with family ties and community norms instead of, bureaucratic business and corporate spirits in terms of dealing with people and things. And there's one-way flow of goods. Usually, it's the rural or the non-modernized communities who provide sources and food and materials to the urban communities. And usually, the urban communities hindi naman siya nagpapadala ng needs ng mga non-modernized societies because nga they are self-sufficient. While in modernized society, there's a high degree of specialization and interdependency, diba? In order for industrial societies to work, they have to make use of new technologies, and each type of technology is assigned to a specific professional who has a specific knowledge set, who has a specific training. So, diba, doctors do the doctoring, nurses do the nursing, teachers do the teaching, right? So each person in an industrialized community is interdependent on each other because they have a specific specialization on the technology that they know how to use, and they're dependent on the knowledge and the expertise of others for the technologies that they need, but they can't operate on themselves. Next, rationality and universalism as a cultural norm, which is very much Western and European. There's high degree of centralization in relation to decision making and policy, very much instead of grassroots ang decision making, usually it's top down, and then it's very much emphasized it emphasizes on money circulation and the market, and then bureaucracy of organizations are also found, instead of flat organizations and informal organizations in communities that are pre-industrial. And there's a two-way flow of goods and services. Now, they're very dependent on pre-industrial societies to give them like food materials, raw materials that they cannot make on their own in the industrial society, because again the landscape is already unavailable for agricultural production. Now, modernization is very much dependent also and influenced by globalization. So, what is globalization? So, globalization is basically that phenomenon that we are already in, no, since the end of World War II, and even earlier than that, no, because there are now increasing interactions between and among countries. So globalization is characterized by increased trade and transaction among countries, increased capital and investment movements, no, multinational corporations, increased and ease of migration and movement of people because of cheaper air rates. And then there's dissemination of knowledge of culture, which is enhanced and hastened by, media and internet technologies. And there is now an increasing establishment of international and multinational corporations. There's what we call, of course, one type of globalization called economic globalization, which means increased trade and transactions between among countries. And, some countries are being pressured to decrease the tariffs to ease upon the transaction, no? And then we have cultural globalization, no, sharing of cultural practices and influencing of cultural practices between and among countries. And there's what we call globalization, meaning global brands taking in local characteristics to appeal to local communities. Like for example, Coca-Cola, in China, Coca-Cola is spelled using their language or their alphabet. So that's an example of localization. Or for example, in the Philippines, McDonald's, which is a global brand, is serving rice. But in fact, originally, McDonald's does not sell rice. So that's an example of an effort to localize. And then we have political globalization, wherein there are political organizations that govern many countries in agreement. So for example, we have the United Nations, World Health Organization, World Tourism Organization, etc., etc. Now, in a global society, countries could be categorized as core, semi-periphery, and periphery. Core countries are characterized by high profit consumption of goods, and they are the ones that basically heads the development of technologies. And then the periphery are the ones usually are poor industrial societies and countries, and basically in the globalized system, their contribution is provision of cheap labor and raw materials to develop the technology that is being innovated by the core countries. And then the semi-periphery are those who provide both technological advancement and high consumption and cheap labor materials to the whole global economy. So for example, in smartphone productions, the ones who will think of the design of iPhone, for instance, is in America, which is a core country, USA. And then the production will be done in the manufacturing will be done in a semi-periphery and a periphery countries. For example, India and China. Because India is a periphery country, China is also a semi-periphery country. But China is a semi-periphery country because while it is also a center for cheap labor and raw materials for the creation of smartphones, China also produces its own smartphones. So kaya siya semi-periphery. The Philippines could be considered as a semi-periphery country. Now let's look at this one. So this chart basically tells us, or this map tells us, that there's what we call a north and south divide, except of course for Australia. So the blue in this map represents the more economically developed countries, and most of them, except for South Africa and Australia and New Zealand, are in the northern part, and the rest of the less economically developed countries are from the south. So that's what we call the north and the south divide. So more developed countries north, less developed countries south. So in this video, we were able to learn about the different theories of social and cultural change. We were able to define and conceptualize what modernization is, and we also characterize globalization as an important part of modernization.